Talk to Me Radio is now live. Welcome to the Jon Gaunt Show.
Well, it's not live today, but it will be live tomorrow. Oh yes, tomorrow, Tuesday, May the 10th. I'm back at 10 with a live show and a suntan. But this is the last of my Talk to Me Radio specials. And I'm delighted to say that in this show, you'll hear from Jonathan Davis, the presenter of Booms and Busts, right here on TalkToMeRadio.com. Now, Jonathan, as you know, is an economist and wealth expert who has a very, very different view to the people you hear on mainstream media, because he quite clearly believes that government should never step in if a business is going bust. He says that's capitalism. In 2008, our banks were bailed out to the tune of £500 million, and taxpayers will bear the brunt of that for years to come. As Jonathan says, it'll be our children and our grandchildren. So I had to ask Jonathan about how we ended up bailing out those banks and why we should have let them just simply go to the wall.
The history takes us back to 1998 when the bailing out of the financial institutions started. There was a massive hedge fund in America, long-term capital management, LTCM, which blew up in what was then the Asian crisis, and it lost at that time an enormous amount of money. Today it's not so much, $2 billion. And the central bank of the US said, well, if we let this fail, it's going to be the end of the Western financial system.
Right.
$2 billion.
How had it lost $2 billion? How had it got itself in that position?
It made the wrong bets.
Okay.
So it all blew up, and they decided to bail it out. They printed some money, and they handed it to the company. $2 billion. Think about that. I'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
Then, that was 98. Then, 10 years later, we had the entire banking industry collapse, and then in the US, they had the TARP scheme, and they gave the banks $800 billion. And of course, we did it in the UK, they did it across the EU, they did it in Japan, and everywhere else, Canada, Australia, you name it, they did it. And indeed, in the last several years, it's estimated that the central banks have printed $30,000 billion and basically handed it to bankers and rich folk. And it started in 1998 with a little one of $2 billion, which they then said, if we let this fail, it will be the end of the global financial system. That's where they went wrong in the first place. They compounded it 100 times in 2008. They should have let the thing collapse, because now, 8 years later, we would not be entering economic long-term depression. We would be on our way to generational prosperity.
So was it really a green light to bankers to be as reckless as they wanted to be? Because in the end, governments would bail them out, which goes against everything that capitalism's about, isn't it? You take a risk. If you win, you win. If you lose, you lose.
You have put it beautifully. That's exactly it. You make your bed, you lie in it. If you make profits, you make money. If you make losses, you lose your shirt. Tough. That's capitalism. But no, we haven't had capitalism in the Western economy at least since 1998.
Right.
Whether or not we had it before, we certainly had it for a period or somewhat like capitalism during Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. And look how economies and prosperity soared, and how people got richer and richer. Not the ultra-rich getting rich at the expense of everyone else, which is what has been happening for the last 10 years. No, the rich, sure, they got richer, but everyone else got richer as well.
Okay, so what should we have done then? Allowed the banks to go bust? What would have been the net effect of that?
Sure, it would have been a short, sharp shock to the system. I'm not suggesting that it wouldn't have had short-term negative consequences? Of course it would. There would have been a very significant rise in bankruptcies, not just in banking, but right across industry and the professions. There would have been a big rise in unemployment. House prices would have crashed. The stock market would have crashed. To which you're saying, well, how on earth could you possibly allow that to happen? Well, bring forward ourselves to 2016. Tata's gone under, BHS, Austin Reed, Intel's just announced 12,000 jobs, Siemens in Germany, you name it. It's happening anyway. The difference is that 8 years later, everyone and every country is absolutely overloaded with debt as well.
So
that's why we're going into depression.
Okay, so why did they do it then? Why did they make this choice?
Because the banks held a gun to the politicians and the central bank's heads and said, do you really want to go down in history as the people who put millions out of work? And of course, the politicians and the central banks who are just bureaucrats, the politicians never do anything to help the people. I've said this on your and my own show. The first two objectives, priorities of politicians is to either get elected or re-elected. So Gordon Brown, Barack Obama, and Merkel in Germany and so on, they all decided to borrow thousands of billions from our children and give it to the present generation of bankers, rich and middle class. Well, I'm sorry, it's extraordinarily selfish, and the next generation are economically toast. And this generation, it's getting worse and worse. Okay. How many jobs are going to be lost at BHS? 11,000. You think that's the end of it? It's the start of it, and I do not say that with a smile.
Okay, and I want to talk about BHS, and I want to talk about that in a moment. So, are you saying then we are going to still go into a massive recession, and therefore when it turns into our two-tier society, is that gap between them and us, the rich and the poor, getting wider?
Right, there's two issues there. I want to cover the second point first of all. The inequalities that we have in the second decade of the 21st century are larger than at any time in recorded economic history. People think that because their house price has risen, you know, the average person bought a house for £100,000 20 years ago, it's now 250. Or in London, they paid 200,000, it's now £1 million. They think, oh, well, that means I'm richer. Well, certainly, if you did it 20 years ago, you probably are, unless you remortgaged and remortgaged and remortgaged. And what about people who bought in the last 5 years or traded up? They have got vast debt, even though they may have some equity in their house. They think they're wealthy. Believe me, debt is not wealth. Thus, anyone who is mortgage-free is already in the top 10% of wealthy in the world. But irrespective of those, what about the top 10% in the UK? In the last 20 or 30 years, unless you're in the top 10%, your above inflation income has hardly risen. If you're in the top 10%, it's doubled, trebled, quadrupled. There is a massive inequality. Now, as to the first point, I'm afraid you're going to have to remind me what it was.
You've lost me there because you mixed both. I was saying about, is that gap between the rich and the poor getting greater? And
it is.
And the age of austerity then, how long is it going to last for? Let's go on to that.
Right. That's right. The first point was, are we going into a massive recession?
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, from all the economic statistics that I'm seeing, that A, we are markedly slowing down our economic growth as I speak. This year will be significantly lower growth than last year. The West as a whole will be significantly lower growth than previous years, which is interesting when you consider all the massive stimulus that they're doing, and we've still got practically zero interest rates. So what's likely to happen this year and next year is that we go into no growth or maybe recession, but this is the reason why we are heading towards long-term depression. Because, of course, for the last 40 years, John, whenever there's been an economic problem, they've reduced interest rates. They can never do that again because interest rates are rock bottom. Thus, if we go into recession or close to it, which I think is highly likely, what on earth can they possibly do to avoid us turning Japanese, which is what I say on Twitter all the time? Japan went through 2 decades of depression. They're still in it. Their unemployment soared. Their house prices fell 65%. Their stock market fell 80%. And they're still not on the mend. That's how bad it could possibly be.
Blimey. That's a pretty depressing picture you paint.
Yes, it is.
And that's mass unemployment as well, I guess. He's tied in with that, isn't it?
Well, that's on the assumption that we don't change anything. If we, however, stop printing money, stop borrowing in order to pretend that everything's okay. We were talking last week. George Osborne, Gideon Osborne, is borrowing over £70 billion a year to pretend that everything's okay. There comes a point when the global markets say enough's enough, you cannot borrow as you are doing. In that situation, they could push up our interest rates. Do not think for one moment that the Bank of England is in control of interest rates. Global markets are in control of interest rates. Well, you can imagine if rates were to rise even 1%, what that would do to a hugely indebted economy as we are in. So yes, it is terrible, and people like me, not just me, I'm not just this one little guy, I'm talking from my office in Hertfordshire, it's not just me, there are some seriously smart, clued-in cookies around the world who get it, but we and they are not listened to by the politicians.
So what should we be doing?
Because it's politically unpalatable to do long-term actions.
Okay, what are those actions that should happen in your opinion?
Well, as I say, we need to stop borrowing. We need to stop over-promising. I'm talking about the politicians need to stop over-promising that they can deliver XYZ services that we cannot afford. We are going to have to take economic pain. We are going to have to see house prices fall. We're going to have to see bankruptcies in businesses that ultimately cannot make their way on their own. For example, BHS, it turns out, had £1 billion of debt. Well, for goodness sake, how many other businesses out there are burdened by debt but are being kept alive for short-term political purposes? It doesn't work. We need to take pain. In that way, the costs of running businesses will plummet, the costs of living will plummet, and from there we can actually get activity going again. While costs are high, we cannot grow.
Now, there's been a lot of controversy over BHS anyway, and the way that the allegation is that Sir Philip Green basically raped the company. Where do your sympathies lie in that one?
Your terminology there is clearly emotive. The fact is,
he took millions and millions in dividends, didn't he?
The rules are.
I know it's not against the law. I know it's not against the law.
I've got 2 points to make. If you own a company, and if you and your board go to the bank and say, lend us £500 million, and bulk up the balance sheet with debt. If the bank will lend it, then you can do it, and then you can pay yourself a massive dividend. It's not against the law. Is it immoral? That's for someone else to answer. What my point is, the bank should not have loaned the money, and if the bank had any thought that it might itself not be bailed out in a coming recession, in a coming banking crisis, that money would not have been loaned. Philip Green would not have been able to take £400 million. So it's the banking system that is the root of the problem in BHS and across industry.
Explain to me then, why would the bank give him that much money? Why would they give the company that much money?
A, because the individuals involved will get absolutely massive bonuses, which will never be taken off them.
Yeah.
And B, the bank itself, of course, will make more profits, share price will go up, and when it all falls apart, BHS is in administration, the loan has now gone bad, who's losing? The bank doesn't care, the people have had their bonuses, the executives have sold their share options. I'll tell you what, the only ones who are at risk here are the shareholders, who are the pension funds and so on, okay, and the taxpayer should the bank go bust. Think about that. The bankers are never touched, they're never prosecuted.
And is it as cynical as that then? Do you believe it is as cynical as that then? They would loan the money, not really that bothered.
That's exactly it. As I say, since the late 1990s, since Gordon Brown basically took over in 1997, he put the word out, particularly by setting up the tripartite system of so-called regulation, which basically meant that no one was accountable for the regulation, therefore there was no regulation. He put the word out, lend, 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 to hell with the consequences, we must go for growth. And that growth simply came from debt on debt on debt on debt, and the only people who pay, the taxpayers.
Because the taxpayer in the end will sort it out. It's a bit like with the pensions at BHS. The taxpayers are going to pick up the tab for that as well, aren't they?
Exactly. The pension
deficit
rescue fund.
Yeah.
Exactly. The taxpayer again. But see again, it's not even the taxpayer, because Osborne is borrowing £70-odd billion a year to pay for all of these things that he and his predecessors have promised. Ultimately, who's going to pay for it? Not you and me, John, not our generation, our kids, and God help them, their kids.
And where does all the money come from? Does the money actually exist, Jonathan?
No.
It's not real, is it? It's not like you say, lend me a tenner, I give you a tenner, then you give me it back on Monday, is it? The money's not actually there, is it?
See, people do not realise, and they'll fall off their chair when I answer that question, which I'm just about to do. Money comes from thin air. Literally, banks at the touch of a button can and do every single day create money. And the central bank, the Bank of England, whenever the government needs to borrow money, the Bank of England pushes a button, all of a sudden another £10 billion. It literally is ones and zeros in a computer. Okay. It's that ridiculous.
Explain that to us in simple terms then, how it actually works then.
You go to your high street branch, either on the phone or directly, and say, I want to borrow £10,000 to buy a second-hand car.
Yeah.
They look at your credit record. If you're basically okay, they push some buttons and they put £10,000 into your account. The £10,000 that they put into your account has a balancing entry in their loan account. And of course their loan account has billions of loans. Literally, that's how it works. Money is created at the touch of a button.
And then when people don't repay those loans, what happens?
In a recession, what should happen is what would have happened in 2008 is the banks would have gone bust. Northern Rock went bust. The depositors were saved. The mortgages were still there. They were passed on to a new bank.
Yeah.
The shareholders lost their shirt. The executives, of course, walked away with millions in their pensions. And the same with Halifax, Bank of Scotland, Royal Bank of Scotland, you name it. Everyone walks away but the taxpayer and the shareholders.
So in the old days, I remember when I first bought my first ever little terraced house, I did the mortgage with the local building society, the Coventry Building Society, I think it was, but I had to wait weeks because they couldn't lend me the money straight away because they didn't have enough money in. And in those days, they could only lend out what they'd got in, and that changed, didn't it? Am I making sense with what I'm saying?
Yeah. That was what, the 1970s?
Yeah, late 70s, 80s, yeah.
Okay, well, in the 1970s, there still was an element
control.
Of not just control, it was self-control really, because there was no regulator, there was no financial conduct authority, or until recently it was called the Financial Services Authority. There was nothing. There was no regulator. The bank or building society regulated themselves because they had to ensure that they were lending to a prudent borrower. They themselves were a prudent lender. If they didn't, in a recession, the bank or building society itself, the banker would lose his job and therefore his house. So there was self-regulation. But then, as I say, when the politicians put the message out that you can lend to anyone who fogs a mirror, however much they want to borrow, and you know what, when it all hits the fan, we'll bail you out. Well, of course, they went and made hay, and they're still making hay because the politicians and central banks are still printing money hand over fist and handing it to the rich and the bankers as we speak.
So
people will think that I must be some anarchist communist. Nothing could be further from the truth.
So are they lending just as recklessly now as they were before the crash?
Well, you tell me. Our country is bankrupt. If I went through the figures, you would be astounded. And yet, our government can still borrow 70-odd billion pounds a year. We're still lending to Greece. We're still lending to the state of Illinois, Chicago, Detroit. You know, in Chicago, there are 10,000 teachers on $100,000 per annum pensions. My point being that their public sector is so ripped apart by the trade unions, they've been borrowing and borrowing. That state is absolutely bankrupt, but they're still borrowing. Yes, they're still lending as if there's no tomorrow, because they know, as far as they believe, as far as they're told, nothing to worry about, because the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, they'll look after the banks. Because you know what was crazy? People will not believe this, but all they have to do is a tiny bit of research. Who owns the Federal Reserve?
Go on.
Private banks own the Federal Reserve.
So it's unsustainable, isn't it? It's all going to hit the fan again.
We're very close to that point. There's no question. When we see the economic growth or lack of coming out of China, when we see America slowing down greatly, of course, the EU is in a generational depression. Our own country is down below 2% economic growth. I think it'll be sub 1.5% this year, bearing in mind all the people coming into the country and all the economic stimulus, and all we can get is between 1 and 2% growth. It's quite remarkable. So as I say, we're going into slowdown. The next stage is that there will probably be another banking crisis. There will probably be another industrial economic collapse in the West. And as I say, they cannot slash interest rates. That's when it's going to hit the fan big time. They will take action again to sort things out in the short term, but it will be, to paraphrase Churchill, it will not be the beginning of the end, it will be the end of the beginning.
And there's no way they can bail out the banks again, I guess.
They can do whatever they want. I mean, they've done absolutely astonishing things which have made me just hold my head in my hands over the past several years. They can do whatever they want. As it happens, in polite bureaucratic circles, they are indeed saying that bailing out the banks is unlikely, but what they will do is they're talking about QE for the people, quantitative easing, money printing for the people. So basically, we're going to have a new deal from the 1930s. Herbert Hoover, Federal FDR, Roosevelt, they had the New Deal, minimum wage. They banned the private ownership of gold. They had the massive infrastructures, the Hoover Dam, the motorways, whatever. All that did was it turned the 1929 recession into the Great Depression. And John, oh my God, they're doing it all over again. They're talking about banning cash. They're talking about infrastructure works. And of course, we've got the minimum and the living wage. They're doing it all over again.
So we can't afford the living wage?
We can afford anything if we can borrow. However, I entirely disagree with the living wage, because all it does is it helps prices stay up. And if people believe that those jobs which are currently minimum wage, which can't be handled by a robot or a computer, they're in cloud cuckoo land, the minimum and living wage, for example, is going to get rid of 2/3 of anyone who works at McDonald's. And that's just for starters.
Okay, so does that automatically bring us on to the steel and the collapse of the steel industry in this country? Should we be doing anything to try and save those jobs?
I believe not. I believe that for governments to intervene to try and pick winners, it's fluff, it's narcissism, and it's ultimately about getting them elected or re-elected. Sure, of course you could do whatever you want to save the steel workers. Of course you could. But it just means that ultimately, when you think about it, the guy on £26,000 a year up in, in Hull with 3 kids and a big mortgage, he's paying for it. Why is that fair? And more to the point, it's not even he who's paying for it, it's his kids who are going to pay for it in smaller pensions, smaller health and defence, etc. spending, and higher taxes. We're only even talking here about normal folk.
Yeah.
The minimum living wage boosts prices, which ultimately, and we don't have the time to go into, but ultimately, do you know who's the biggest beneficiary of the minimum wage? The ultra-rich, because they have got masses of assets which benefit from inflation in assets, and they are the ones who benefit directly from inflation in assets, and they will therefore benefit more from the minimum wage. I know that's hard to believe, but I tell you, that's what's happening.
So we're going to have mass unemployment then as well, are we?
I suspect so. As I say, if we go into recession, which I'm telling you, the economic statistics are very clear, we're going into rapid slowdown. I wouldn't be surprised to see actual recession next year, maybe even in the second half of this year. And they can't slash interest rates. You know, I've said it 3 times, but it's obvious that's what they've done every single time there's been an economic problem in the last 40 years. Well, they can't do it again. Thus, that to me means there's going to be business bankruptcies and job losses. It's going to be terrible. People who have bought houses on massive debts, they better make sure that their income is secure.
And I suppose a lot of people who got themselves into the buy-to-let market, got an extra house where they're trying to plan for their pension, that's all going to hit the fan as well, isn't it?
I talk about this all the time. I write about it all the time as well. House prices have been in a bubble, particularly in the south of England, for 10 years. There was a 20-25% fall in house prices in 2008 with the last recession, but all those property investors and indeed just ordinary folk who have borrowed to the hilt to buy a place, blah, 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 they were bailed out because interest rates were slashed from 5% to 0.5%. Well, as I say, if we go into slowdown or even recession, which I think is more than possible, they can't bring interest rates down again. Now, that is not to say that they won't, because actually, this is what's even crazier than anything I've already said. We are going to go to what's called negative interest rates, believe it or not. And
well, they'll pay us interest.
Sorry?
What does negative interest mean?
Yeah. Well, they've already got it in the Eurozone. They've got it in Japan, Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark. It means that major multinationals and indeed banks are actually paid about 0.5% per annum to borrow from the central bank. The idea being that if they borrow from the central bank, that they'll lend it out. Well, they're not actually lending much to small and medium-sized enterprises. They're lending to themselves, to the multinationals themselves, which doesn't help Joe Blogg's furniture maker down the road. Does it mean that ultimately we might have negative mortgage rates? Believe it or not, it's not impossible, but it's totally crazy. It's absurd. It shows you how mad and bad, is the phrase I use, these central banks are. But I'll tell you what, if and when we go to negative interest rates, I tell you, it might help a few people, but it is largely very deflationary. It's going to be exactly like Japan, turning Japanese, 20 years, economic depression.
Okay, and finally, before I let you go, how do things like the Panama Papers play into this? And what we found out about the super rich, the uber rich, or things like when we argue about Amazon or Google not paying enough tax. Is that all an irrelevance, really?
So what did we find out with Panama? That the ultra-rich are not paying as much tax as you and me.
Yeah.
I think we have to go back to the movie Casablanca. Rick, I am shocked there's gambling going on in this casino. As if we didn't know that that's not been going on forever since ancient Greece. It's a fact of life. The likes of Winston Churchill tried to put a stamp to it, to stop it. Even he, the great man, couldn't get it through. That shows you how powerful these people are. The Bilderbergs, we hear about them every year. The Davos crowd, we hear about them every year. They are hugely powerful. It doesn't, to answer your question though, it doesn't actually fit into it because we've always had it.
Yeah.
The problem is that what we have now is, Gordon Brown said he's ended boom and bust. Well, of course, that was a total joke. However, what they are trying to do is end bust. The problem is they're pulling further and further on that elastic band. And I'll tell you what, it snapped in 2008. It's being pulled extremely tightly again. When it snaps, potentially 2008 could merely be the hors d'oeuvre, and the main course is still to come.
But the rich will still be rich.
The rich will still be rich, the poor will still be poor, but if we bring in capitalism and we let failed businesses go bust, in the short term, sure, it will be extremely difficult for the majority of folk, but in the long term, well, we can always, with lower costs of business, yes, we can start competing with East Europe, with China, but with high cost of manufacture, high cost of services, we cannot compete with these people. It is mathematically impossible. So if we bring in capitalism, the cost of living and cost of businesses will fall. We can compete. We can get the economy going again. But while we continue to bail every Tom, Dick and Harry banker and businessman out, we will never be able to compete. We will go into long-term depression.
Wow. And therefore, are the conspiracy theorists right when they talk about Bilderberg and they talk about the super rich and the bankers? They're actually in control, not the politicians. Just as
Oh, yeah, of course they're in control. When you look at apparently the most powerful politician in the world, the President of the United States, that position is bought and paid for by Wall Street. Yeah. Obviously, when you've got billions of dollars going into a presidential campaign and it comes from Wall Street, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, and that's where it all comes from. We have democracy, but it's like I think I've said before. It's two wolves and a sheep bed down for dinner. They have a vote. Guess whose dinner?
What an optimistic interview. No money, no chance, and no government. Jonathan Davis, you can catch him live every Monday on talktomeradio.com at 2 o'clock.